They say every house has a story, but some stories are better left untold. I thought I found the perfect home, but it didn't take long to realize it was never meant to be mine. When I first moved into the house, I thought I had found the perfect place. It was an old Victorian house, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The price was unbelievably low, but there was something about it that seemed almost too good to be true. The realtor didn't say much about its history, but I wasn't looking for a mansion. I just wanted some peace and quiet, away from the chaos of the city. The neighborhood was secluded and serene, with tree-lined streets that seemed almost picturesque. It felt like I had stepped into another era, a quiet little corner of the world where nothing could go wrong. The house was full of character. Its old, creaky floors and tall windows made it feel like it had a story to tell. I imagined making it my own, repainting the faded walls, restoring the antique features. It was everything I needed, or so I thought. But as soon as I stepped inside, a strange feeling washed over me. A chill in the air, a sense of weight, something lingering in the corners of the rooms. At first, I brushed it off as just nerves. It was a big change. I had never lived alone in a place like this, but that feeling never went away. It hung in the air like something unsaid, an invisible presence that followed me from room to room. The first few days were fine. The house had its quirks, drafty hallways, windows that wouldn't shut properly, but nothing that screamed haunted. It felt like a typical old house, with its creaks and groans. But then, I started to notice things. Small things. Nothing alarming at first. A book left open on the floor. A chair turned slightly toward the wall when I was sure I hadn't touched it. Things that could easily be dismissed, except I hadn't touched them. It was as if the house itself was shifting. No one else was in the house, and yet there they were, subtle signs of change. I chalked it up to me being too paranoid, but something inside me was telling me this wasn't just a coincidence. At night, I would hear faint noises, scratching, like something was moving in the walls. Again, I told myself it was just the house settling, but every time the noises came, I felt like someone, or something, was listening with me. The sounds would start soft, almost gentle, like a distant animal pawing at the walls. But then they would grow louder, more frantic, as if something was desperately trying to escape. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sounds seemed too real, too close. But something was different. Something was wrong. The air in the room felt heavier, as if it was thickening with each passing night. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, trying to read, when I heard it, a loud bang from upstairs. It wasn't a creak or a thump. It was a full-on crash, like something had fallen. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. My mind raced, thinking of the possibilities. Maybe a bookshelf had toppled. Maybe a picture frame had fallen off the wall. But I had to check. I grabbed a flashlight and went up to investigate. The darkness in the hallway seemed to stretch out before me, oppressive and unwelcoming. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way to the stairs, and the silence grew heavier with each step. But when I checked, everything was just still. The room was in perfect order, no broken objects, no signs of anything having moved. I walked through each room, checking the corners, the shelves, but there was nothing that could explain the sound. I stood there for a moment, breathless, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. I told myself I had to be imagining things, but that night I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could hear it, soft footsteps, pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate steps. They didn't sound like someone moving casually. They were calculated, almost as if someone was trying to be quiet, but wasn't succeeding. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon in the attic. But then, the door to the attic slammed shut. I froze. There was no wind, no draft. The house was completely still, and yet the door had slammed shut with such force that it rattled the walls. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to my presence. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The silence that followed was deafening. It felt like the entire house was holding its breath. Then, I heard it again, the faintest whisper of a sound, like something shuffling in the attic. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The oppressive feeling of being watched settled over me like a dark cloud. A week later, I was making coffee in the kitchen when I felt it again. A presence, right behind me. My skin prickled. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. There was no one there. Just the faint smell of dust and the soft hum of the refrigerator. But something wasn't right. Just a flicker of movement. A shadow, fleeting and elusive, passing through the corner of my eye. It wasn't just a shadow. It was as if someone, was moving through the room without making a sound. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. Later that night, I was sitting on the couch, trying to watch TV, when I heard a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind or the house settling again. But this whisper was different. It was a voice, a low, urgent voice, calling out to me from the hallway just outside the living room. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like it was coming from the shadows themselves. I stood frozen, listening for it to return, but it never did. The silence that followed was almost worse. It pressed in on me, filling the room, thick and suffocating. As the days passed, the incidents became harder to ignore. Things moved. Objects I knew I had placed in one spot were now somewhere else entirely. Books scattered across the floor. A chair moved from one side of the room to the other, even though I hadn't touched it. But what scared me most was the feeling, the sensation of something watching me. No matter where I went in the house, I felt eyes on me. Eyes that weren't mine. Eyes that didn't belong to anything human. I began researching the history of the house. I found out that it had been empty for years, but the last owner, a man named Thomas, had died under strange circumstances. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones, telling stories of strange occurrences before the house was sold. Figures seen in the windows, lights flickering on their own, the strange coldness that would come over the house late at night. But what caught my attention the most was the warning. "Stay away from the attic," one neighbor had said, her voice trembling. "You don't want to know what's up there." The more I learned, the more the house seemed to respond. The air grew colder in certain rooms. The whispers returned, louder, clearer. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the hallway when I was the only one at home, and when I tried to leave, it felt like the house itself was holding me there, keeping me inside. The front door would refuse to open. The windows wouldn't budge. I could see the world outside, but I couldn't reach it. It felt like I was trapped inside the house's grip, and the more I struggled, the tighter it held me. One night, after a particularly unnerving day, I went into the kitchen to get a drink. When I opened the fridge, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dim light of the fridge, was a note. It wasn't there earlier. I would have noticed it. The note was handwritten, and all it said was, "Get out." I didn't know how to respond. Who had left the note? Why was it in the fridge? I slammed the fridge door shut, but when I turned to leave the kitchen, the lights flickered, then went out completely. I stood in total darkness, hearing the soft sound of breathing, but it wasn't mine. It was coming from behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. No one, but the feeling of being surrounded, of being trapped. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I reached for my phone, but before I could dial, I heard the distinct sound of something or someone walking up the stairs, slow, measured, as if it were waiting for me to make a move. I had to leave. I had no choice. I grabbed my things and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in. I pounded on the door, desperate to get out. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then the door finally creaked open. I ran out into the yard, my heart pounding in my chest. As I looked back at the house, I saw it. There, in the top window, a figure standing perfectly still, staring out at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. And then the lights inside flickered on, one by one, like someone was flipping them on just to watch me. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, and when I finally looked back, the house was gone. Not physically, but it was as though it had disappeared from my memory, as though I had never lived there at all. I left the town soon after, but I can't escape the memories. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again. I hear the footsteps, and I can't shake the feeling that the house is still out there, waiting for the next person to make the same mistake I did.